Okay, let's play around with the second of two mentions by Jesus of the word ecclesia or church. Remember, we're operating off this basic assumption that from the basic Greek word that the disciples would have understood that when Jesus says the word church or ecclesia, he means a group of people. He means a called out group that's now living together. And if we look at the idea of Matthew 18, we're looking at maybe specifically the concept of a spiritual family. You know, this is the operating system, the model, if you will, from which Jesus is kind of coming up with this idea. But now we're going to look at the second mention chronologically, which is in Matthew chapter 16. And this one's going to present a different idea. If the first idea is the concept of a spiritual family, okay, we'll keep this up there because we want to keep this in mind. So spiritual family is what we looked at in the last mention from Matthew chapter 18. Now we're going to look at Matthew chapter 16 and see what comes from this. So let's look at the text. Matthew 16 verse 13. It says, when Jesus came to the region of Caesarea Philippi. Now, this is a tiny little sentence, and if you don't, pay attention to geography, then this could really, undermine really the meaning of a lot of this text. But a very simple study, it lets us know a lot of what's going on, even in that one little sentence. So what's just happened is that he's brought them to the foot of Mount Hermon. This is the location of Caesarea Philippi. This is the place kind of known as Herod Philip's capital. And what this is, it's a huge, like rocky cliff, if you will. If you can imagine Caesarea Philippi, I mean, it's not a giant area. There's one central feature to it. And it is that there's a rocky sort of flat area. And then it kind of like has a wall, a big rock wall. And on that rock wall, you've got all these carved holes into the side of the wall where the idols that represent false gods would stay. And in this scenario, just to give you a full picture, if you're looking up, and you're seeing the rock wall, and you're seeing these different like Pan and different kinds of false gods in there, then to the left at the bottom, if you look that way in your mind, there's a little cave like sort of hole in the mountain. And from that cave flows this water from deep in this dark kind of recesses of the cave. And the water comes around and sort of flows right in front of this rocky area, kind of creating a little set apart spot where people would go onto this little rocky area, look up at the false gods, and would conduct all kinds of unmentionable types of craziness. So much that I won't even mention it. That's how unmentionable it is. But imagine there's things that these fertility gods want their followers to do, and people were willingly doing that. This was the ground zero of just psycho-pagan activity. I mean, if you wanted to rally a bunch of people together to do the most heinous thing in Jewish culture and go to the most heinous place known to Jewish culture, this was it. This is your downtown New Orleans during Mardi Gras times 100. This is that spot. This is that moment. This is the Strip in Las Vegas, times 100. This is very real, very anti-God stuff happening. And Jesus brings his youth group there. So he's like, let's take a trip. And by the way, this is like a 30-mile journey. And that 30-mile journey it really just has like a long trip, a sermon, and then about face and go back. That's kind of what this whole thing is. So it lets you know, in the understanding of like how rabbis would operate, there's something about this particular location that he's trying to utilize for the teaching and equipping of his disciples. And there's no doubt in our minds, right? I mean, walks 30 miles, blah, 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 go back 30 miles. You'd really hope as a disciple there's some reason we're at this location, because could we not have just done this back home, So this is what's going on. So he's taken them to Caesarea Philippi. He's got them there, and he says in verse 13, continues, it says, he asked the disciples, who do people say the Son of Man is? So he's brought them to this place, and there's all kinds of crazy going on. Imagine off in the distance, maybe you have people at that moment, sacrificing to these false gods. And who knows what else is happening. These guys' disciples there, I personally have been to this location. There's like interesting little nooks where you can sort of sit, where you can see off in the distance the top of that rock. And so it's an interesting place. It's all kind of set around this really pagan activity. And so he says, who do people say the Son of Man is? So imagine you're a disciple, right? And you're looking, past through Jesus, you're seeing behind him all of the crazy, And so as you look like through him and you go, man, I really hope my mom doesn't ask me where the rabbi took me this trip, because I don't have to tell her where we're at. And so he says, who do they say the Son of Man is? And Peter replies back, they replied, some say the John the Baptist, some say Elijah, still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets. Now, those are some good dudes to be compared to, right? That's not offensive to Jesus. He's going, Elijah? Yeah, all right, he's a pretty passionate guy. Verse 15, he says, but what about you? Who do you say I am? And now Simon Peter speaks up and he says, you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. Verse 16. 17, Jesus replied, blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by flesh and blood, but by my Father in heaven. Pretty amazing response, right? I mean, not only does he have the question right, but Jesus is going, and just so you know, my Father is interacting with you to be able to give you such profound clarity about my true identity. So now Jesus has been labeled as the Messiah, the one, the true anointed one that we've been waiting on. He's able to say that very clearly to Jesus. And he finishes in Jesus' response to Peter, and he says, and I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church. Remember? My church. This is the second mention, the second time the disciples will hear this explicit phrase, ecclesia, this word ecclesia, to their ears. And this is from Jesus to them. And he says, blessed are you, Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church. Now, there are two pretty debated interpretations over what he means, and I want to add in a third one and say, I think all these are good. Why not all of them? One of them is that when he says, blessed are you, or I tell you, Peter, that on this rock I'll build my church, he's saying that Peter is the rock, and there's some possibilities to that. Peter's name is basically Rocky, and so he could have been doing a rabbinic kind of name play to go, here's why I gave you that name, Rocky, because you're going to be the foundation. You'll be the one, the core, thing, the core person that we're going to build this my church thing out of. It's not going to be your church, Peter, but you'll be the rock that I will use for my church to build upon. And there's truth to that, right? There's truth that Peter becomes very influential in the New Testament church. There's also some questions about that particular interpretation, I mean, there's other disciples who do a lot of stuff. Certainly the Apostle Paul does arguably, more in terms of writing, the real estate of the New Testament by the Apostle Paul is much more than that of Peter. And you also see even in the usage of the word, the word he uses isn't exactly the same word for Peter. He could have used it a little bit different. It would have laid right on top of his name, but it doesn't, And then, so there's another interpretation. The interpretation is that it's not Peter that's the rock, it's the confession. It's the idea that he just said, you're the Messiah. And Jesus is going, that right there, that truth that I'm the Messiah, I'm going to build my church off of that truth, that reality. That would be another way of saying it's my church. It needs to be centered upon my identity as Jesus. Is that a true statement, whether or not it's the meaning of this interpretation or not? Yeah, absolutely that's true. There's no question in our minds that the New Testament church is founded upon Jesus. His confession, the confession of him being our Lord, King, and Savior, is definitively the foundation of the church. But it still doesn't answer the question, why does Jesus bring them 30 miles, do a sermon and turn around and leave? I mean, these 2 points could have been made anywhere, just go to the Sea of Galilee, hop on a boat and just say, who do you say I am? Why here? Why Caesarea Philippi? Why are we told they go there? Remember, Caesarea Philippi is just a rock. That's what it is. And so when Jesus says, upon this rock I will build my church, the third interpretation is what he's saying is that you see these people that are crazed, that are pagan, that are lost, that are oppressed, that are lied to, that are deceived. You see these people? Upon this rock, I'm going to build my church. And so you guys have been kind of a group, an ecclesia, if you will, that's been learning to be a spiritual family. You've been learning how to operate in deep, deep, authentic relationship with one another. There's not 500 of y'all that are trying to all, talk and be deep. You've learned how to operate in a way that's very much modeled off of even the very size and operating system of the kind of the nuclear family, the biological family. But now that we're in Caesarea Philippi, what if Jesus, what he's saying is, I want this family to understand that you're not just a spiritual family, you are also a missional force. You are a force to be reckoned with that will advance my kingdom to the ends of the earth. And I don't want you as a family to rebuild the same thing that the Jewish people built back in the day, where it's walls and entrenchments of protection of who we are as the Jews. I want this church, my church, to be missional. I want it to go. I want it to be the fulfillment of the Genesis 12 covenant, where all of the nations are blessed through this line of belief, through faith. And so I want you as my church to be missional, to go. Who are you going to go to? Well, I brought you to the worst of the worst, the most lost of the lost. They're right here, off in the distance, sacrificing, doing all kinds of crazy things to deceived, false God mentalities that have entered into them. And I want you to know that if my church is going to be my church, I want it to not only include, but to champion these people. Go after the least of these. Go after the lost, the poor, broken, the oppressed. Let my name and my love cover all of the earth. Now, the reality of this actually manifests so clearly in Acts chapter 10, verse 27, goes on into about verse 45. And you see so much, depth and clarity to when these Gentiles, when these pagans that have been for so long kind of avoided by Jews, when they become front runners in Jesus' church, you see this happen in Acts chapter 10. And you see Peter himself, who's the one dialoguing with Jesus, actually struggling and eventually coming to victory by him going, Gentiles, they're becoming front and center in the church. Why? Because the disciples eventually learned to be that missional force. Now, you may say, hey, that's, there's three interpretations, and how do you really land on this? How do we know he's talking about these messed up people, And not that these people are any more messed up than the disciples are, or we are. You know what I mean by that. But he's targeting people that are clearly enamored with things that are against God. And so how do we know he has them in mind? Well, listen to what he says after this section, verse 18. Go to the rest of verse 18. He says, I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church. The rest of the sentence, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it. Now, this little cave I told you about, where the water comes through, and it's kind of this idea of the gateway to the underworld. The common known name for this is the gates of Hades, the gates of hell. This is what it was called. It was known to be sort of a gateway into the underworld. Now, a lot of that's just legend, and who knows how much of that's really true, but there's probably a lot of anti-God, demonic type stuff happening there, and it was a very oppressive place to a lot of people, and people would voluntarily go there because they were deceived. And so this idea of the gates of Hades, see, Jesus roots this into not just the physical geography of the Caesarea Philippi account, but he roots it into the reality that what he's saying about his church is that it's offensive, right? That the church cannot exist as a defensive idea. It's not reactive. It's not like we're going, well, we're just gonna, we'll be here if you need us. You know what I mean? You know where the building is, you see the steeple, you come find us, That's not what he's promoting. He's promoting something that is offensive against the gates of hell, that actually busts through the gates of hell to rescue people from the grasp of darkness, of lies, of oppression, of poverty, of whatever, that we as the church are a missional force that goes after it. Now he continues in verse 19. He says, I'll give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, right? So he's going to empower this missional force. It's not just a bunch of, just sling your bodies at something and hope it goes well. That's not what he teaches. He teaches, I'll give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, And again, listen to what this may remind you of from our previous teaching in Matthew 18. I'll give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. And this becomes, such a clear, beginning sort of mental awareness of what will become the 5 commission texts that Jesus will give: to go and make disciples, to go and be my witnesses, to be sent in the way I was sent. This missional force it becomes sort of the point of one of the 2 defining moments where Jesus pulls his disciples aside and says, let me tell you about my church, a spiritual family, a missional force. And I would argue this is the raw material. This is what the disciples know coming into Acts chapter 2. They understand it is Jesus' church, a spiritual family, a missional force. And I think this was enough for them to understand how to grab hold of what Jesus intended for his body, his bride, his temple. Now, we have many more mentions of church throughout the New Testament. But I would argue of all those mentions, they will all Velcro to these 2 central practical concepts and all fit under the general umbrella of it's Jesus' church. He's at center. So hopefully this helps put us in the mindset that I believe the disciples were in the Acts 2 experience, as this understanding, this revelation of Jesus' church really sort of hit the ground in a powerful way through the Holy Spirit.